Hello and welcome to another Juddmonte Farms FanPage podcast. I'm Matt T. Child. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe, a race in which Enable might be making history on Sunday. Firstly, I have to make not an announcement, but I have to say that there is someone who won't be here or taking part. It's always disappointing when that happens. But Chris Ellams, who was supposed to be on, isn't. Technical issues on his part, I think. But that leaves myself, Craig Walker, who did the last podcast with me, and Kitty Trice. God, I've been dreading saying that. She will be with me as well. And we'll go straight into discussing Sunday's race, with the main focus being Enable. So they're my guests. So let's get started. Kitty, first of all, because myself and Craig talked a bit about Enable on the last podcast we did. Has there been anything she's done so far this season that has made you doubt that she's as good as she has been in recent years?
I think it's hard to judge by this season because her first race in the Eclipse, she needed the run. Gosden was very clear about that. And then the King George, she showed her usual enthusiasm, and she kicked away from two good horses, although Japan clearly didn't perform. And the September Stakes was just a warm-up. She was entitled to win as she did. But I think the acid test will be in the Arc, but I can't see anything visually from the season that suggests she's not as good as she was last year.
Craig, her last two victories, obviously the historical one in the King George and then in her prep at Kempton, she's won both of those without necessarily having to be at her best and coming off the bridle as such. Do you think that's a benefit coming into Sunday's race, that she hasn't necessarily had a hard time this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. One of the things that I think we kind of touched on last time was that obviously she was going to miss the Yorkshire Oaks, which was one of the sort of prep races that had been involved on a previous occasion, opting to go straight for the September Stakes. I think that the sort of lesser campaign will be more suitable for her coming into this. As John Gosden has admitted himself, she's getting older. She needs a bit more work with age, which is understandable, given that she's 6 years old now, prepping for arguably the biggest run in her career, trying to win that third Arc. I would say that, as kind of touched on by Kitty there, she was entitled to win as she did last time in the September Stakes, posted a nice time without having to be really fully worked out. And obviously, as we discussed on the previous podcast, the King George was really a walk in the park, given Japan's sort of underperformance there too. So yeah, I think that the sort of relaxed campaign will definitely suit her, and it's all systems go for Sunday, really.
On the flip side, is there anything she's done that hasn't impressed you? It's hard to make that conclusion really off the back of just 3 races, and she's won the 2 that she has comfortably enough. But
yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would say that, again, we kind of touched on last time, was I was a little disappointed at the lack of competitiveness in some of those races. Whereas we looked at, obviously in previous years, we had the likes of Crystal Ocean taking her on in races like the September Stakes and the King George and things like that. This year was a 3-runner affair. I mean, there wasn't really a lot to go off there. So that, although that's not necessarily a fault of Enables, I just wonder if that might have been it didn't show us a lot in terms of where she was at. She's posted some nice times, so we know that she's in good heart, but I think I would have liked to have seen a bit more competitive, even from a UK or Ireland perspective. There's a lot of O'Brien horses that could have probably ran against a lot of UK horses up and coming that might have even been able to give it a go and try and take that crown off her. But from Enable's point of view, that, again, like I said, that's not necessarily her fault. In terms of a run, I can't see anything that, that to me indicated that she's not in good heart. Our first run back, as we've already said, she was entitled to need that. She was only about 85% fit. Going down to Gaeth, who's obviously went on to bigger and better things and obviously posting a nice rating. So yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to pick on. One of the things, like I said, was just more, I was a little disappointed that there wasn't as much competitiveness in those races.
Kitty, many people will point to the fact that the ground was really testing in Longshot last year, and that is what probably got her beat in the end. How big a concern is the ground this year? It's going to be on the heavy side once more. Just how big a concern is it? How worried are you about her capabilities of coping with it?
I think when it comes to this race, it'll be a matter of who copes with it best. And as far as I've seen, although she hasn't actually run on heavy, I think Longshot last year was very soft. I can't see why she won't cope with it. I mean, this isn't me trying to criticise Frankie. Like, obviously he's a brilliant rider. I don't pretend to have anywhere near his capabilities. But if you had to slightly critique, you could argue he did go for home reasonably early, but you know, the front 4 or 5 did in that race, so I guess he had no choice. It's a question mark for all of them, I think, this ground. So I think it's just a matter of who will cope with it best, and hopefully she will.
Yeah, I mean, she has her first arc was won on soft ground, but I suppose she had the benefit of being a 3-year-old filly, not carrying as much weight. But the counter argument to that is she's now 6, fully mature. You'd be more than hopeful she'd be able to handle it at this stage of her career.
Yeah, no, she's shown herself to be versatile on grounds. I think the French sort of measurement of sort of ground conditions, I mean, just how heavy is it? And just how much rain will there be in the next 48 hours? Those are the 2 questions that everyone will want to know. But she's shown herself to be so versatile, and you can question whether a lot of those in the race have had, can deal with the ground as effectively as she has shown herself to be able to.
And Craig, there's no Voltgeist this year, and also there's no Love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise, but not so much. I think the sort of betting markets kind of indicated that something was changing in the sort of stance of the race. Love has always been the strong favourite, with Enable in a close second favourite, but that swung earlier in the week, and there was a lot of negativity towards Love in terms of that front. I do think that I am a little surprised, because I still think that the Arc is one of the great races to win. However, I can understand maybe the logic. Love does seem to prefer the better ground, the softer ground, when obviously in the early 2-year-old sort of runs with Love, didn't seem to work to the best effect. Seems much better on the better ground. So I can see why they're opting for something like the Breeders' Cup turf, which is probably going to be a more suitable race in the long run. But yeah, in terms of ground, and Voltgeist obviously was the one who was the only one finishing last year. I mean, when you look, I watched the race again earlier just to sort of get an idea of where everybody was sort of positioned. And as Kitty mentioned, obviously everybody was up there sort of early. They committed early. So Frankie, as we've said, probably hasn't had much choice other than to pretty much go for it. And you're only looking at the last 50 meters when the heartbreak happens. It's only because Voltgeist is the one with the wet sail, literally finishing faster than anything else. Nothing else is coming from behind, and those in front are literally paddling. So in terms of this year, you've got to be wary of something that might be strong on the ground, somebody who's really going to love it, being a proper bog out there. Is Enable the right one for it? I would say that there's arguments for and against. Obviously, last year, we saw that obviously she just flattened out towards the end, but she'd beat everything else. In terms of the sort of last sort of 100 yards or so, it's going to really come down to whether something's finishing on the outside. Again, looking back at those races, Volgeist come right down the outside. Sea of Class the year before come right down the outside and almost caught. So as long as there's nobody finishing with a real wet sail in those sort of heavy conditions, that's going to be the real worry for Enable if she's out in front on her own.
Kitty, we mentioned there that, Love isn't running, and, everyone around the world knows the Prix de l'Arc de Triomphe. It is one of the great international races. How much luster does that take off this year's renewal, her not being there?
I think it's a shame. I can totally understand why Connections have decided to take her out. She's a beautiful moving filly, and she's shown her best form on good ground. It's taken away a bit, but Enable's bid, I mean, we might not see this again for years, if not ever, so that's still a major part of it. And then, of course, you're not forgetting that she takes on her stablemate Stradivarius for the first time, who I think will play a big part. So there's that angle as well. And then I think Andre Fabre doesn't run horses for the sake of it, and Persian King is quite interesting. He needs to show he can go on that ground, because he didn't earlier in the year behind Palace Pier. But like I said, I don't think Andre Fabre runs them for the sake of it. So I'm tempted to keep an eye out on him as well.
You mentioned Stradivarius there. I mean, he could be the fly in the ointment, I suppose. I mean, in an ordinary year, I personally couldn't fancy him as a stayer. I think he does his best work late on. I know he's got a turn of foot, but I think a turn of foot over 2 miles is totally different to a turn of foot over 1.5 miles. But does he come into it more on this ground, even though his record suggests that he too would like it much better?
Well, he won the Ascot Gold Cup on pretty testing going. You can question what he beat there, but he absolutely cantered home. I mean, this is a different test over 1.5 miles, and as you say, and he needs to show he can compete with the best at this trip. But it's interesting. He's got quite a wide draw. I think he's still 14, so he could. I mean, it depends what his rider decides, but he could, sit reasonably handy, and then when others start sort of paddling, he could be right there. It'll be interesting to see what sort of tactics unfold, because obviously Serpentine, I think Ballydoyle are going to try and make him go forward, A, because that's his style, and B, just to possibly try and get Frankie to commit early. Could be very interesting, the whole tactics.
Craig, Stradivarius, he's been beaten twice this season by Anthony Van Dyke, or at least Anthony Van Dyke finished in front of him behind Gaeff in the, what was it? Was it the Coronation Cup at Newmarket?
Yeah.
Range one. You wouldn't fancy Anthony Van Dyke to win an Arc, would you?
I wouldn't, not based on any of the form that I've seen sort of recently from Anthony Van Dyke. Although I was saying that obviously a good win in the Prix, but beating Stradivarius last time, he wouldn't have been my idea of a typical Arc winner. With Stradivarius, obviously we know that he's a champion steer. We know that he can handle some testing conditions, as we've mentioned. The Ascot race was obviously pretty boggy, and I think Gosden had also said that he would probably struggle in those conditions, but he made a mockery of it, really, in reality, at the Ascot. I mean, again, we don't know fully what he was really up against. Obviously, the staying division isn't as strong, maybe, as it was at one time, but he couldn't have done it any easier. And they've always been floating the idea of the Arc, and it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion for a horse like Stradivarius. Steers have historically done fairly well in this race as well. We look at the likes of Order of St. George, who ran a good race in recent years. Westerner, another one who won steers races. And
wasn't Ardross placed in it as well?
Yeah, Ardross was another one who ran, obviously, in those sort of steer races. So steers do typically have the sort of profile to get close in a race like this. And yes, he couldn't quite reel in Anthony Van Dyke, and it just makes you wonder, is he quite as good at this distance as the sort of staying distances where he's a foregone champion, basically, because he's beaten everything that he's come up against, more or less. But I think that the bar that Anthony Van Dyke sets at 1.5 miles isn't maybe as high as some of the others. So it just makes me a little wary whether he's got the proper class to cut it at 1.5 miles. He's a class horse, there's no doubt about it. But again, that turn of foot that we mentioned seems to kick in over the staying trip. We saw that when he got into trouble a couple of times this season and pulled it out with just that pure staying power.
Kitty, how much do you think John Gosden wanted to run Stradivarius in the Arc? I know his owner Bjorn Nielsen is the reason he is running, but him aside, how much do you think John Gosden would have been looking at this race for, essentially, as Craig said, the dominant stayer of the age?
It's an interesting one, because obviously Bjorn Nielsen wants him to run. Gosden hasn't traditionally run his horses much against each other, so I'm not sure if he'd have done this time without the owner intervening. But he seems, obviously he's going to seem up for it in front of the cameras. But it's a whole new challenge, and it could pay off. I mean, you have to question over 1.5 miles against the likes of Enable, but, why not try? You've got to try these things, I think.
As a racing reporter, would it be disappointing if Stradivarius won an Arc?
I personally don't think so, just because I think he's got a very, very good turn of foot for a stayer, and when he ran in the Coronation Cup earlier this season, he hadn't had a run. He needed the run. I think Gaiath won in record-breaking time, and he wasn't that far behind him. So you can't be disappointed with that. I don't think you can fully judge him on that. And then his Arc trial, I don't think you can fully judge him on that, because the race wasn't run to suit, whereas I think this will be quite different with the likes of Serpentine in there. So I don't think I'd be disappointed if he won. Obviously, it'd be disappointing for Enable and her connections, but I still think Stradivarius is a top class horse, as he's shown so many times.
Well, moving on from him, and earlier you mentioned Persian King. How much of a case can you make for him jumping? I mean, he won a mile. He won over a mile the last time we saw him. He won the Prix de Moulin, beating Pinatubo, but he has taken a massive jump in distance here on this kind of ground. How much chance can you give him?
I would be pretty worried about the ground for him, because behind Palace Pier, he didn't seem to particularly like it at all, although that's Deauville heavy ground, which is a different matter. I think it's interesting Farb's put him in. I wouldn't, he wouldn't be without a chance, but I think the ground is going to be a big question mark for him.
Craig, any thoughts on Persian King?
Well, I think it's an interesting angle again. Obviously, from being from Andre Farb, master trainer, obviously knows how to win this race. He wouldn't be running this if he didn't think there was a chance that Persian King could show a good outing here. I think the step up in distance is going to be interesting, because again, not really run this far. Furthest Persian King ran was around about 1.2 miles, so 1.5 miles is a new question. Did run behind Sotsas, so there's some sort of interlinking form there, but the ground again might be a little bit of a question, although there was a heavy ground win from him back in 2019 when he won the De Poulan Group 1, beating Sharman. I think there's not enough conclusive evidence to say that he will definitely stay and that he'll definitely love the ground, and this is the type of race that he can win. This is a big jump up in terms of obviously what he's done so far, But last time he was quite impressive from the front end. He shot off in front. He held his own and obviously held off Pinatubo, who was fast finishing. But the race was run. It was a bit of a strange run race from memory. I think him and Circus Maximus, I think it was, who shot off like a long way clear. So it was a very sort of strange run race, because I think there was about 10 lengths back to the rest, and I think they thought that they were just going to come back to them. But obviously that didn't happen. So he kept on well there. There's definitely a chance that he can run well, and he's definitely got an each way chance if he stays.
I mean, for all that I'd love Kingman to sire a breather like the Triumph winner. I mean, that would be something else. And for Andre Fabre, you have to respect him. I can't see it personally. I can't see him staying. I really can't.
I think the staying is the biggest question mark for me. I think the ground is okay. We've seen some glimpses of heavy ground form, but like I say, the distance would be the tricky part for me. I wouldn't want to say for sure, but I mean, you know, we've seen stranger things before.
You mentioned Sotsas there, and Kitty mentioned him off before we came on air. I say that like the three of us talk all the time. He is a Group 1 winner this year already. He won the Prix Gannet at Chantilly, and he was third in this race last year. Has he shown the same kind of form this season, Kitty, to make you think he could go 2 places better?
He hasn't really, and his trainer has said that, but you know, again, a French-trained horse, aimed at their biggest race, you can never quite rule them out, and he's shown that he can handle these sorts of conditions. He has been slightly disappointing, but I thought he was staying on at the end in the Irish Champion, so maybe a step back to a mile and a half will help him. I do like his chance. He's got a nice draw. I think he's near or next to Enable. It's just whether he can deal with even heavier going. But I couldn't rule him out.
I must admit, I was pretty underwhelmed by his performance in Ireland. I mean, Connections didn't go there just for a day trip. They went to be competitive, and he was just never competitive. I know he was taking on the likes of Magical and Gayef, but I just expected a bit more from him that day. Yeah. Especially if we're now looking at him as an art contender. But as you say, a French-trained horse being aimed at their biggest race, you can't rule him out. And especially on his run last year, when Craig, he showed that he handles this kind of ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a soft ground specialist, and definitely the sort of horse that you want to be on the right side of in a race like this, just purely for his ability to stay on the ground. He definitely stays the distance. He ran a good race last year. As we've said, probably just a slightly bit underwhelming this year. I thought there was a couple of chances that were probably penalty kicks for him, especially early in the season. He was entitled to need his first run back. He won next time, but then I think he just got touched off the time before. The Irish Champion Stakes, as we've sort of kind of discussed, he didn't really get fully involved, and I think I would have liked to have seen him a little bit closer if I wanted to really see him as a real contender to beat the Enable. However, I would say he's got the strongest chance of the French contenders, just purely because of his great run last year. And if this is what he's been aimed for, he's going to be spot on for it based on the runs he's had this year.
Aidan O'Brien, as you would expect, and Coolmore are mob-handed. They like to throw a lot of darts at the board, and although they haven't got Love, they have got 3 other interesting runners. Which of those, Kitty, would you say was their number 1 chance? Ryan Moore's obviously on Mogul, so that jockey bookings alone would suggest that he was their number 1. But in your eyes, is he the one that Enable has to worry about the most?
I'm not a massive fan of Mogul, just because he's been slightly in and out, but he's a bit like his brother. He needed his first couple of runs. His Grand Prix de Paris win was, it was impressive, but that was on good ground. Can he cope with the heavier ground yet again? He's got, I think there is more to come from him, but I personally quite like Serpent, like just from their battalion. I think Serpentine could be interesting because he had a break after his Derby win, and he ran well enough, like, in fourth behind Mogul without really sort of, threatening. But I think that was just a prep. Like, he had, a month and a bit break. So if he comes back, if he improves on that even, then and goes from the front, that could be quite interesting as well.
I mean, he's drawn widest of all, so that will be an interesting tactical angle. What will Christoph Simeon do? Where do you stand on his Derby win? I mean, at the time, we looked at it and said, he was handed it, and he just got loose on the front end. The form of the race, it has produced a couple of group winners since, including Mogul and this is embarrassing. What's the William Muir horse called? Is it Pile Driver?
Pile Driver, yeah.
But overall, was he just the best horse on the day, or was it a bit of a fluke?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, Emmett gave him a brilliant ride. I think the other jockeys assumed he was a pacemaker and just acted accordingly. But at the same time, I think there was something about his sectionals. He did produce some very fast sectionals. He kept staying on, and his run in the Grand Prix de Paris, I think it was inconclusive because I think it was very, O'Brien said he'll very much need that, and it's a stepping stone to the Arc. So I can't really judge him just yet, not least until he runs on Sunday. But I think the Derby, the form, some of it's worked out well, but then you've got the likes of English King, who's been pretty disappointing overall. So I'm sort of in the, I'm quite inconclusive about it at the moment.
He hasn't got any form on this kind of ground either. Where do you stand with Serpentine, Craig?
Well, I think the Derby win was a lot more impressive than people give it credit for, especially seeing as he was allowed to bowl on in front. As we kind of said, he looked like the typical pacemaker. They tried a similar tactic in the Oaks earlier on the card, and it didn't quite pay off then, but that pacemaker did run fairly well. Obviously in this case it was the same sort of thing, and you knew at the bottom coming into the straight that he was never going to get caught, and those times have worked out fairly well. My thing with Serpentine is it was interesting last time. He probably, as we said, needed the run, but I didn't think that the tactics employed were obviously anywhere near what they were at Epsom, so it was an interesting run, and I thought it was more of a get a run into him type run rather than trying to go out fully, like full belt and win in some ways. My concern would be, because of his way that he can bowl along in front, as we saw in the Derby, is he going to get his own way in front? And also with quite a wide draw, is he going to get across to try and take that sort of lead and things like that? So that's going to be my sort of concern about Serpentine. Whereas Mogul, which we talked about earlier, he's always been a talking horse for O'Brien. There's always been like quite highly held in regard, but it's been very on and off, very hot and cold. Sometimes he produces something good, like the Grand Prix de Paris, where it was an excellent performance, great one, great finish, easy win. But then sometimes can throw in the odd strange run where he did at Ascot. He was never involved. He looked under pressure quite quickly. And my concern again with him would be things like the ground. So I would be a bit worried about his chances, especially from the wider draw too.
The fact that his brother, Japan, finished fourth in this race last year, again, he is probably better on a better surface, but he did handle conditions last year. Does that offer hope that Mogul will take to it?
It certainly does. And in reality, if I was just looking at all of the pieces of form in front of me on all of these O'Brien horses, I'd be looking at Japan as being probably one that would be more like an archetype. He looks like the type of horse that would run in an arc. He can definitely stay the distance. We know he handles the ground. He ran a great race last year. Probably even shocked a few people at how well he did handling the conditions and things like that. So for me, he would be the idea of somebody who would be in the placings at least. I don't know whether he's good enough to win the race, of course, but he hasn't shown as much this year as I would have liked. Based on last year, where he went into the race on the back of a few wins, the ball was rolling, he was getting those wins into him. This year has been a bit underwhelming, especially when he was a long way behind Enable in the King George, and it was a really disappointing performance in my opinion. So I'd be a little bit concerned whether he's in as good form as he was last year coming into this race, but he's definitely got the potential to get there.
He was 16 and a half lengths behind Enable in the King George. Is there any chance of him? Well, I'm sure he won't finish that far behind this time, but is there any chance of him reversing that form, Kitty?
I mean, it's been documented he's had problems with his feet. He just, I don't know, he's a bit of a funny one. Like his Juddmonte win hasn't worked out as well as, one would have hoped. I mean, you can never really rule out anything trained by O'Brien, but at this stage, I'd have just liked to have seen a bit more from him this season. And he folded quite tamely in the Irish Champion Stakes for me, and he's the one I just couldn't be confident about if we're talking about O'Brien's sort of his horses really.
I mean, he also has Sovereign in the race, who won the Irish Derby last season in similar fashion to Serpentine at Epsom. I would imagine he's going to be sacrificed as the pacemaker, or at least he's going to be up there. But of the three, Kitty, the main hopes, I'm guessing you're siding with Serpentine more than the other two, anyway.
I mean, it's a close one between Serpentine and Mogul. I'd probably just favour Serpentine at this stage. I think he could, if he gets loose on the front end, then it could be an interesting pace angle. Whether he'll set it up for Enable and Stradivarius could be interesting, but if he's not stopping, then it's an interesting one. It's always an interesting one, the Ballydoyle tactics. So yeah, I'd probably side just about with Serpentine right now.
Do you concur with that, Craig?
I would agree with it if Serpentine was drawn more closer to the rail. I think if Serpentine was maybe drawn where Japan is, I think I would have felt a bit more confident on that. I'm just a bit worried that he might get caught out wide, especially if he wants to try and get to the front, because I think there's going to be a few pushing forward. As we mentioned, even Sovereign could be pushing forward. Interestingly about Sovereign, obviously his Irish Derby win was a good win from the front, similar to Serpentine, as you mentioned. And he beat Anthony Van Dyke that day, which, ties in with some of the form we've mentioned earlier. Whether that was a bit of an inconclusive race or how that was won and how the race actually panned out, I don't know. But maybe he could run well, depending on whether he's fully sacrificed as a pacemaker or whether he's actually going to sort of run to his ability. But for me, I would say I kind of think that although he hasn't had the best season, I think Japan's probably going to handle the conditions a bit better. And if he can bounce back, for me, he's probably the main hope of the Ballydoyle ones. Unless Serpentine can get across and get the lead, then he would probably be the one.
It's interesting what you say there about the draw. I'm sure I read earlier, don't quote me on this, that in the last 19 years, I think there's only been a handful of horses that have, or there have been none who've won and been drawn higher than 8 in the arc. So the draw is bound to.
Yeah, I think the only one who was caught out quite wide and won was Golden Horn, I think.
Yeah, I think it was probably him. He's the only one in 19 years to win from higher than 8.
Yeah, so that alone gives a bit of concern for those drawn out wide, especially those who probably want to be on the pace like Serpentine. But if he can get across and get to the lead, we know what he's capable of. We've seen it at Epsom.
Are there any others, Kitty? I mean, we've mentioned a lot of the main hopes, I guess. Are there any others that stand out to you?
I think the German horse is quite interesting in Swoop. I think, based on
Well,
his
he's French trained, but he did win the German derby.
yeah. Yeah, I think on his pedigree, he should, the ground shouldn't be a problem, and he's quite lightly raced. It's just his form, whether he can cope with this sort of, this is the biggest race in Europe, and these are the best horses he'll come across. But he's quite interesting, although he's got quite a bit shorter in recent days.
He's actually the one that I quite like of the outsiders. He's the one. He's got form on soft ground. His pedigree says soft ground. I think that was a step up from his German Derby win to finish second to Mogul in was it the Juddmonte Grand Prix de Paris with Serpentine behind him. I just worry about his inexperience and he's drawn in one. I would have actually preferred it if he was drawn a bit wider. I worry about him
getting trapped.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I must admit, I quite like it. I think he's I think he could, on this ground, I think he'll come out on top from that trial form. I think he's the one that will appreciate it the most. Craig, of the outsiders, any standout?
I think another one that I quite liked was one of Jean-Claude Rouget's Rabiha. I've been quite impressed with him. I've been following him a little bit this season, and
The filly.
Yes, the one drawn on the outside there. I think he was very impressive back at Deauville, beating Wangari by 3.5 lengths in the Group 3. It was a really electric turn of foot, and I was quite impressed that day. And he marked him at that point as a possible outside contender for a race like this, obviously, if he continued to improve. He was a little bit disappointing last time when he was second behind Tarnawa in the Prix Vermeil. But he was held up a long way out the back, and I think at the time, Christian Demuro possibly maybe thought he had like a bit more horse underneath him, and by the time he'd actually got going, the bird had flown. But I think given there's a lot of pace angle, this could set it up for a closer. And he's definitely that. He's got a real good turn of foot. My main concerns are the ground and the distance. There's not really enough evidence to say he's definitely going to love it. But she's by See the Stars. So
finally.
I can see that, there might be a potential that she might stay on quite well. But again, I think she'll be picking up some of the pieces, like if there's a real fast pace, which there could be with some of these front runners.
Right, I think that's pretty much Deirdre. Anyone going to give hope for her?
I don't think it's a year for Japan this year, put it that way. I just think a Nassau Stakes win was impressive, but there hasn't been enough there for me to think.
A long time ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, there hasn't been a lot recent. Soft ground still brings some question marks. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a long shot for them. Maybe might run well, maybe get a place at best, but I can't see it happening.
Right. If I give both of you, we'll let ladies go first. So Kitty. If I gave you 3 against the field, who are those 3 that you side with?
So I would go with Sotsas, Serpentine, and then I'd put Enable. So I'd take those 3.
Craig.
Okay. Well, Enable, obviously. Rabiha and Sotsas.
Right. Well, No one wants to know what I think, but I think Enable, heart and head says Enable. I think In Swoop will run well, although he's probably not quite good enough to win. And a third, I liked what you both were saying about Japan. I must admit, you both swayed me towards him and thinking that he could run much better than I initially thought. So I might just throw him in.
I think if I had 4 picks, I would put Japan in. That would be me 4. It's very tough, but I do think there's hope. Like if he can get back to his best.
And are we in agreement that Enable's going to make history?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right. I don't know why we just didn't say that at the start. We could have saved our whatever it's been. So my thanks to Craig and to Kitty. I've got to do the preview for the race on Saturday, I think it is, for the Juddmonte page. So I'll look forward to doing that. Thank you very much, the pair of you. And let's look forward to the race and hope, fingers crossed, we get the result we want.
Yep, hopefully so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.